Mark Rogers TV talking Super Bowl with New England taking on Philadelphia. One of the very few, although if as we go along through history, the repeated matchups, of course, are going to grow the list. But this one was played back in 2005 with the Patriots winning, of course, by 3 points. We bring in Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Information to discuss the line and some of the prop bets and so forth. Steve, how you doing this afternoon?
Hey, Mark, doing well.
All right. My first thought was a pretty obvious thought. Patriots are going to win this game. Who bets against Tom Brady in a huge game? The two times that he lost, obviously, he wasn't on the field for the conclusion for the most part. And but that the Patriots with a 5.5-point line, that's going to be difficult because they seem to win all these games razor tight.
It's amazing. Throughout Super Bowl history, maybe the first 40 years or so of the Super Bowl, the point spread rarely mattered. Usually the underdog would win outright, or the favorite would win by double digits and cover rather easily. Only a handful of times did the point spread matter. Now you fast forward to the last decade or so, you have the most dominant team in Super Bowl history with Tom Brady and Bill Belichick now in their 8th Super Bowl. Yet almost every one of those games has been decided by, actually every game has been decided by 3 or 4 points until last year, in which the Patriots won by 6 because of overtime. So that should have been a 3-point game. The 2 games they lost, of course, to the Giants, they were actually a 2-touchdown favorite in one of those games. It was actually a pretty bad loss. But the games they've won have all been tight, like you said, including that Eagle win back in 2004. So this is the one team you do have to worry about the spread. And I think that's one of the many reasons we've seen the line drop over the past couple weeks. The public has very short-term memory. I think they saw New England struggle against Jacksonville. They saw Philadelphia blow out Minnesota from start to finish. And that's another reason why the public looks to be on the Eagles. In fact, over 60% of the consensus is on Philadelphia. And that's without the public really playing the game yet. I mean, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the next 3 days are going to be when the heavy money comes in from the public. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this line drop further. It opened 5.5. It's been holding 4.5 all week. We're starting to see some 4s out there. Keep in mind, the look-ahead line before the NFC and AFC championship games a couple weeks ago was going to be 7. And that's where they projected this line to open. But because of those results, it opened 5.5, and it's come down even lower since.
So, Steve, refresh my memory on last year's game. Was that about 3.5 to 4 points?
Yeah, exactly. The overtime touchdown made the difference there. And keep in mind also the game went over the total. It was in the mid-50s. It was actually about, I think, 56 or 58, depending on where you looked at it. It was actually the highest over-under in Super Bowl history. And it also went over because of the touchdown in overtime. We look back a few weeks ago to the Alabama-Georgia game. We talked about it here on the show. 13-0 at halftime, and then the second half opened up, and because of overtime, the under bettors lost and the over bettors won. And Alabama also scored a touchdown there to win by 6. It's amazing how the Super Bowl last year and the title game a few weeks ago played out very similar. And it's not a fluke, Mark. We see it throughout history. Games normally start slow. Teams are a little conservative. They don't want to make that first mistake. Then things open up in the second half. We often see defensive touchdowns or kick return touchdowns, more so than you would see in a regular game. So you have to remember the Super Bowl is not a normal game, and it definitely plays out a little bit differently, and that's been proven throughout history.
I know, and we talked about that the last time we got together in regards to the championship games, and then the stakes heightened here, that there are more special teams plays, defensive scores. I would think it would be the opposite, that the better the teams, the more that they would prevent those type of mistakes on special teams or a bad turnover turning into a pick six or a fumble return for a touchdown. But you obviously set me straight on that one. I do have 2 questions concerning last year's game and what could be done for this year's game in regards to the point spread. So my first thought is that I really agonized last year. So I was pretty much on the game in regards to the Patriots winning by 3 or 4. I don't remember what my final score was, but it was like 31-27, 34-31, something in that range. Can you protect yourself? Is there a way to serve up some type of play in which you can protect yourself against overtime? Because if they don't play an extra session, it's obviously a push of a game, which it can't be. It would be, if it was an old college football game, it would be a tie. And had you taken Atlanta in 3.5 or 4 points, you'd win the game. But the overtime obviously lost for Atlanta. Is there a way to safeguard overtime?
It's a great idea, actually. It's funny. We have almost 1,000 props at some of these sports books, and I don't think I've ever seen a regulation bet Which makes a lot of sense. I would think people would actually take that, like you said, especially considering we saw overtime in the Super Bowl last year and in the national title game this year. I think that's a bet that would have a lot of appeal to people. Now, keep in mind, the first 50 Super Bowls never had overtime. Last year was the first time in 51 Super Bowls that we had an overtime. But we've had more competitive games recently. One of the reasons it never happened for a while in the Super Bowl was because in the late 80s and the 1990s, most games were blowouts. And that's another reason why the point spread did not matter, because we had dominant franchises, mostly from the NFC, such as the Cowboys, the Redskins, and 49ers before them, the Giants for a bit. And those teams were just better franchises than those AFC counterparts. Denver and Buffalo especially, they just didn't match up. We don't get that anymore because of free agency and the way these teams change, and because we have more parity than we've ever had in the NFL. It really is amazing that a team like New England keeps getting to the Super Bowl when we really have more parity. But as we've seen, they've barely won every one of their Super Bowls. The games have been close. They've been tight. So, I think overtime is a definite possibility. Again, one way you could protect yourself is, instead of playing the full game over or under, or even the full game point spread, you could look at first or second half. You could look at quarters. And that actually brings me into an angle I like to use quite often in the Super Bowls, and it continues to work. And that's for the first half to be lower scoring than the second half. A lot of sports books have that prop where you could take the second half as the higher scoring half. You usually have to lay half a point, but it works year in and year out. It worked last year. And one of the reasons is, once again, teams start slow. They start conservative, but then the floodgates kind of open in the second half, especially when a team gets behind and starts to press. And we saw that last year. Once again, New England did not score a touchdown in the first quarter. In fact, they have not scored a touchdown in the first quarter of all 7 playoff games with Brady and Belichick, which is just a remarkable stat. So it shows that they always start slow. And you got to figure that Philadelphia, being a young, inexperienced Super Bowl team, will probably not want to take a real aggressive start either, especially with a backup quarterback in Nick Foles. So I think you could look at the first half under if you like the unders, or maybe the first quarter under as opposed to the full game. That way you don't have to worry about overtime biting you again.
Yeah, as you mentioned, around the point that we were growing up watching Super Bowls for the first time, I picked about 16 straight right, not because I picked the games that well, just because the NFC was that dominant and in that kind of fashion between about 1981, 82 in the mid 90s with the Redskins and the Giants and so forth, and the 49ers. In looking at the money line, so that was probably my second thought when I saw Patriots win this game. Boy, they always win them close. You're going to take a hit financially on the money line, but it seems to be not a certainty, of course. They're two really good football teams, but how many people would opt, because of the Patriots' style of play and their history, to go money line? And what would, let's say, $100 bet play out if you just take the Patriots in the money line?
Yeah, once again, it shows why you always have to be nimble and flexible as a handicapper. You can't get stuck in your ways, because as I mentioned earlier, for us, the first 40 years of the Super Bowl, it probably was a terrible play to take the money line, because basically every game, the underdog either won outright or the favorite won big. So the point spread never mattered. So if that was the case, you're better off laying the points with the favorite at 11-10, or taking the plus money outright price with the underdog. That, of course, has changed in recent years. We've had a lot of tight Super Bowls. And as we've talked about, New England has been the one team that consistently plays 3 or 4 point games. So I think it actually makes sense to take New England on the money line here if you like them, instead of laying the 4.5 points. Now, I do expect that point spread to drop this weekend. It might get down to 4, maybe 3.5. But what's interesting about the money line in the Super Bowl, Mark, as opposed to regular season games, the public always plays favorites. We all know that. They're actually on the Eagles in this game, which is unusual. But they like to take plus money on underdog on money lines, because they normally don't play the money line. Where it comes into factors is like big prize fights. We saw this in the Mayweather-McGregor fight this summer. They were all over McGregor at plus 300, plus 400 at 4-1, because they don't like to risk a lot to win a little. They like that big lottery payoff. So once again, in the Super Bowl, the money line is usually lower than it should be, because the sports books know they're going to get more action on the plus money underdog to win straight up. And that's the case here. New England is minus 200 or less. In fact, in Las Vegas, they're minus 180 in a lot of spots. Now, to put that in perspective, normally in a regular season NFL game, minus 180 would be like a 3.5 point favorite. Yet the Eagles are a 4.5 point favorite in this game. So you actually are getting value on the money line here. Instead of laying 4.5, if you take the minus 180 money line, you're basically playing the team that would be a 3.5 point favorite. And as we've said, New England's won a lot of games by 3 points. So I think it makes sense in this case.
Do you remember what New England's odds were to win the Super Bowl at the beginning of the season?
They were definitely the favorite. I don't want to say they were as low as 3-1, but they might have been. In fact, the odds for next year are out right now, and they are 3-1 at a lot of sports books to win Super Bowl 53. So yeah, their odds are pretty low. Obviously, Jacksonville would have been astronomical. I think you would have had a huge payoff there. The Eagles were up there. They were probably in the top 8 or so, maybe around 20 to 1. But once again, yeah, you weren't getting a huge payoff holding your money for 6, 7, 8 months with New England at 3 to 1.
I know that I saw some stories last year, one in particular about some guy, I forget the financial figure, but it was somewhere in the $20,000 to $50,000 range, who had put his money for New England to win the Super Bowl before the season started. So basically, he can't lose if he works the math and he goes and plays Atlanta to win the actual game.
Correct, and that's what you could do here with Philadelphia. I mean, you're getting them at almost 2 to 1, plus 2 to 1. So you'd have a plus price on New England to win the Super Bowl. I would think maybe you've already hedged it a bit with Jacksonville, and I'm sure betting you wish you hedged it a bit when they were losing by 10 in the fourth quarter. In fact, Jacksonville had a 93% chance of winning with 10 minutes to go in the fourth quarter the other week with that 10-point lead. And that's just, once again, how amazing that New England found a way to do it again. And that's, once again, another game that was close. They won but did not cover against Jacksonville. Another reason why you can make a case for the money line here. New England has a tendency to do what they need to win, but not win big.
That percentage of victory, I always question that, because New England has the ball. They're down 2 scores. There's still plenty of time left. 93%. I understand that the odds are against them strategically, but it just doesn't seem like, if that situation plays out 100 times, that New England's only going to win 7 times.
I agree, and I don't pay much attention to it either. In fact, I didn't even see it till Monday, the day after, when I was looking at some box scores and doing some recaps. They had that chart available, so I looked at it more out of curiosity, because it's not something I follow either. And I was actually surprised that they only gave the Patriots a 7% chance. But I believe Jacksonville had the ball 10 minutes to go, up by 10. And what they're basing that on, I guess, is historically throughout all football games. And once again, it's a good point that you have to factor in the intangibles, because obviously New England and Tom Brady are not a typical NFL team. And what's interesting, too, is you look at their defensive numbers year after year. Yards per play, they'd be a very mediocre defense, yet they never give up that many points. And it's the same way again this season. They're giving up over 6 yards per play defensively. That's almost a yard and a half, or almost a yard more than Philadelphia gives up, yet they only give up about 18 points a game. Those two numbers don't correlate normally. They have that bend but don't break defense, but year after year, those are the numbers they have. So the Patriots, more than any team I've ever handicapped in my 21-year career, they outplay their statistics more than anybody. Turnovers obviously play a big role. Tom Brady normally doesn't make mistakes. And getting back to the game itself, I think that's the real X factor here. Can Nick Foles play at the level he's played in these 2 playoff games? He had a nearly perfect quarterback rating against Minnesota, the best pass defense in the NFC. Now he's on a neutral field. He's in the biggest stage of his life. I just get a feeling. I think if you're making a case for New England, that's probably the best handicapping angle you can use, is that Foles has an off game.
And Steve, I still love my idea about overtime. I don't know how many times all of us agonize on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon watching our underdog that's getting 3.5 to 7 points, driving down the field, losing by 3, ready to kick the game-winning field goal. And we just want them to just go away, just lose the game, lose it by 3. We're fine. We don't need to go to overtime and risk the touchdown loss.
I agree. I'm surprised with sport, as creative as sports books are around the world nowadays, and with thousands of props on this game, it really is amazing that somebody hasn't offered that. We need to trademark that. We need to patent it, because I think it's actually a very good idea, and I think people would be appealed. What would be interesting about that is the adjustment between the full game line and the game's line and the full game line, because obviously underdogs is where you get screwed over in overtime, and unders, as you're mentioning. So you would have to lower those spreads a bit. So if somebody had a 7-point dog, do they become only a 6-point dog now? That would be what's really interesting to see, the intricacies of the line adjustments.
And that's where Vegas would get guys like me that don't do the math to the degree that the pros like you do, and they would catch us over time probably. In any one instance, sure, I'd probably come out in good shape, but over time that they would really put the screws to the financial situation on that. The prop bets. So what catches your eye? What seems to be interesting, Steve?
Well, one thing, I'll do my prop bet 101 disclaimer here, and that, first of all, is a money management thing. People always go overboard in the Super Bowl, especially people that just play football, because it's the last game. They don't care. Their money will be free for the next 7 months. But if you're really taking a true investment approach like my clients do, you have to be very careful with the prop bets, not because there's not value. In fact, I think there's tremendous value. There's more value with the props than the game itself. But you have to be careful with your money management, because normally the way you're handicapping these props is going to be somewhat correlated to the way you think the game is going to play out. For example, if you think it's going to be a defensive battle, you're going to like a lot of the under props on yardage, and other things. Vice versa, if you think it's going to be a high-scoring game, you're going to like a lot of the receiving yards and rushing yards and passing yards to go over as well. So if you have 7, 8, 9, 10 props and they're all somewhat correlated, you don't want to be playing a full unit on every one, because then all of a sudden you have 9, 10 times more exposure on the same outcome than you would normally have. So keep that in mind. But I do think in general, like a lot of the Patriot reception props over are worth a look. New England always has that conservative, short, quick passing game. Tom Brady's a veteran. He's very accurate. I do think Philadelphia is going to get some pressure on him, just like Atlanta did last year. That also will lead to some quick passing plays, which means, some of the yardage props might not be as high for the receivers, but the reception props will be. So I think in general, some of the receiver props over total catches is worth a look.
Steve Merrill joining us from Pro Sports Info. Join him right there. Football, baseball, and basketball insight from a 25 or 30-year veteran. So, Steve, something you just said brings me to this point. And again, I'm a novice. I'll throw out the idea. But I think one of the mistakes people make, like me, is that they figure it's the Super Bowl. We're going to spend more money on the bigger game. All games are created equal in regards to the statistics and what they tell you. So a Major League Baseball in mid-July could be a good play. Just because it's meaningless in the standings doesn't mean it can't be a good play. And it doesn't mean that you need to break the bank on the Super Bowl just because it's a bigger game. Your thoughts about that?
Oh, no question. I mean, to be honest, the Super Bowl really has a lot of value because it's a huge marketplace, and any mistakes are going to be easily corrected. There's no secret information. There's no player. I mean, we know everything about everyone. Where you find your value this weekend is on one of the 100 basketball games on the board on Saturday or Sunday in college hoops. And all you have to do to really want to know where the value is in sports betting is to look at the house limits. If they're taking a huge limit on a bet, they're pretty confident in that line. If they're taking a small limit, there's value there for the bettor. College basketball sides, you could probably bet maybe $5,000. Super Bowl, you could bet $1 million. We've already had that happen. An example during the regular season is over-unders. The limit for over-unders in all sports for total bets is much lower than side bets because the over-under lines are weaker. Small conference college basketball, for an ACC game, you can maybe play $5,000 or $10,000. One of these added games from the Big Sky Conference, for example, or the MEAC, maybe it's a $500 or $1,000 limit. So all you really have to do to know where the house edge is and where the house edge isn't is to look at the betting limits for all the different sports. And the Super Bowl is the biggest betting limit of the year because the odds makers are pretty confident in the number. There's nothing out there that's not known by everybody and their brother. That doesn't mean you can't find value, though. And an example, as I said earlier, the props are where the value is. We'll have 9, 10 props for my clients on Sunday, and those limits are much, much lower. The prop limits are $1,000 or $2,000 each, whereas the Super Bowl side is $50,000 to $100,000. They'll let you bet $1 million on it. So once again, that's where you find your values with the props, with the college basketball. The Super Bowl is a fun event. I've had a lot of value with it over the years. I've made money, but it's one game where you make your money consistently is playing those other sports and playing them every day.